First presentation on a sacred text will be David Bowles, who will share with us insights on the Heart Doctrine in the Buddhist tradition.
There are currently three major philosophical traditions in modern Buddhism, and there have been a very large multitude of threads that evolved throughout its history prior to the current configuration. This multitude of threads was particularly prominent in the initial 1,000 years of Buddhism, starting roughly the year 600 BCE, owing both to the initial reliance on purely oral tradition and later propagation over vast distances amongst a huge range of cultures. Notably, Indian, Chinese, and Tibetan are the best known. In fact, to this day, there are quite a few new subthreads of Buddhism evolving as the faith has propagated on a global basis across the world that has become tied together through increasingly advanced and rapid communication and transportation systems. The Heart Sutra is a foundational sutra of the Mahayana Buddhist tradition and is one of the most succinct and distilled statements of Mahayana Buddhist philosophy. While it is derived from the Mahayana tradition, what is discussed in the Heart Sutra is applicable to all of Buddhism. Historically, the heart is not part of the original Theravada tradition of the Pali Canon. It was passed on from roughly 600 BCE, but derives from a rather later period. As with all things in early Buddhism, the origins of the Heart Sutra are very difficult to date due to the many threads of the original tradition of Buddhism and the later editing of written versions of documents as they circulated around the Buddhist world that stretched from across much of Asia. There are some strong indications that the version of the Heart Sutra that we see most commonly used today dates very broadly from the year 700 Christian era, much later, or Common Era, much later than the text date in earlier periods. As a side note, translated segments of the Heart Sutra referenced in this presentation came from a version that was introduced by Thich Nhat Hanh, the recently deceased Vietnamese Buddhist monk, scholar, and teacher with whom many are familiar. Hanh produced a particularly well-considered original translation of the sutra shortly before the end of his life. Among other things, this translation dispensed with distracting doctrinal conflicts with Theravadism that have crept into other translations. It is important to understand that Buddhism as a social, philosophical, and religious movement demonstrates universal agreement across all subdivisions, Theravada, Mahayana, and Tibetan, in regard to its most fundamental propositions. These are the foundational beliefs that serve as its bedrock. These include the three jewels of Buddha, Sangha, and Dharma that form the social foundation of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths that serve as the philosophical spine of the faith as a whole, and the Noble Eightfold Path that follows from the Noble Truths and lays out the Buddhist prescribed path to Nibbana. There are a great many more universally agreed subordinate propositions that flow from these. It is completely fair to say that there are no fundamental theological issues separating the schools of Buddhism in the sense of theology referring to the nature of deity or, to a lesser level, the non-deific nature of the Buddha himself. For those who choose to investigate the concept of Buddha nature, for example, that plays a key doctrinal part in Mahayana and Tibetan traditions, it is an interesting doctrine and one that has attracted particular attention from theosophists because it is in harmony with some theosophical teachings. The central focus of the Heart Sutra is the issue of emptiness, or śūnyatā in Sanskrit, its esoteric meaning and its very broad implications. Of all the teachings on emptiness to be found in the Northern tradition, for example, Mahayana and Tibetan Buddhism, probably the most ubiquitous is the Heart Sutra. To quote, it is recited daily in Buddhist communities from Ladakh to Hokkaido, from Taiwan to Baikal, not to mention at the Buddhist monasteries and centers throughout the Western world. It is structured around the insight into the true nature of the 5 skandhas. The sutra begins with a discussion of the 5 skandhas of form, sensation, perception, memory, and consciousness that mediate our contact with all that we perceive in our reality. Note that the term contact covers all elements that link us with what we would perceive as being manifested reality. Central importance to recall throughout our discussion of the Heart Sutra that the key to gaining an understanding of emptiness is in gaining a full appreciation of the nature of the skandhas. Emptiness is an essential trait of the skandhas. To quote from the sutra, Avalokiteshvara, while practicing deeply with the insight that brings us to the other shore, suddenly discovered that all of the 5 skandhas are empty. And with this realization, he overcame all ill-being. The reason for beginning the discussion with the skandhas is that, were it not for the active agency of skandhas, what we are calling reality in this world would not exist for our consciousness. There is no agency through which we would come into contact with it. The Buddha realized that without the conscious contact provided through the agency of the skandhas, our material world would be utterly beyond our concept of reality. In Buddhism, all of the presumed reality that we experience exists only because it is mediated through the through the agency of the skandhas. What is presented to us in any dimension addressed by the skandhas is a construct with no independent meaning or existence for us outside of them. The upshot of this situation is that we impose a sense of reality onto our sensory experience that, like the projected image of the wizard in The Wizard of Oz, is actually an apparition that is empty of substance. In Buddhist terms, all that we perceive is empty. The central substance of the Heart Sutra that follows is an extended declaration of the nature of emptiness and its consequences. It is important to understand that, like all things in samsara, the term empty does not imply a total void, but rather discusses the nature of self and non-self within the bounded material context of samsara. This is the universe that we experience every day, though the sutra holds that our understanding of it may be limited and wanting because of its illusory nature. Some of the great difficulties in discussing the Buddha's attainment, and the reason why he refrained from directly addressing the issue, is that attainment itself involves removing any realization of self from the bounded context of samsara and gaining a wholly different and alien perspective. Put another way, rather than resulting from a progressive development of abstract capacity to realize some sort of ultimate perfection, attainment of nirvana, as discussed by the Buddha and others who have attained, is essentially what can be adequately described as being a complete change of state, like water changing to steam. This implies a discontinuous break with all that we know and experience. By contrast, the term empty addresses the essential nature of our understanding and perception of things in our shared reality. What makes the discussion of emptiness difficult is that the experience of it is sufficiently removed for a mundane interaction with the immediate environment that it can be a bit elusive at face value. To quote from the sutra, "Listen, Sariputra, This body itself is emptiness, and emptiness itself is this body. This body is not other than emptiness, and emptiness is not other than the body. The same is true of feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Here, the sutra is directly addressing the skandhas as being empty of any form of permanent, independent reality. The nature of the skandhas can only be comprehended if they are truly understood with deep insight. The narrative then continues in an even more startling direction. Listen, Sariputra, all phenomena bear the mark of emptiness. No birth, no death, no being, no non-being, no defilement, no purity, no increasing, no decreasing. This statement puts us in direct contact with the nature of emptiness. There is no independent existence, and hence no inherent character or substance to the skandhas. To understand the Heart Sutra, one must begin by gaining at least a provisional appreciation for this concept. Emptiness means that all that exists is an illusion that is based on an assumption that the skandhas have intrinsic substance and meaning that is not actually there. The fact that we can describe something perceived through the skandhas using linguistic constructs is perfectly adequate at the surface level, but does not give a deeper foundation in reality. The essence of the sutra is that the surface sense of substance is not merited and is dissolved by studying and observing and gaining insight into its underlying nature. The full reality of both is both impermanent and empty of independent existence. Confusion in understanding this concept is relieved somewhat by realizing that Buddhism posits that all things exist simultaneously on two levels, and more typically, depending on one's depth of realization, on a continuum between the two levels. As we noted, we are naturally attuned to the surface level of seemingly solid material appearance. From there, what you perceive just depends on how deeply you look and comprehend the illusion of the skandhas. The Heart Sutra is a stark, basic statement of a spiritual truth that is realized fully at the end of a train of insights. With that in mind, let us consider the following metaphor. Imagine that we have a statue carved out of a bar of soap. This is something that many of us did as children as a recreational activity. Now imagine putting the carved bar of soap figure, into a bowl of water. As you watch the soap and water interact, the features carved into the soap gradually disappear as it dissolves, until the form represented is no longer identifiable as a representation of a known object. The whole nature of our sense contact is inhibited, though not completely eliminated. In the example we're discussing here, the form reflected in the carving is empty of independent existence and is impermanent. Further, the soap carving dependently originated from a chain of predecessors, including the chain of events that produced the soap bar itself, going all the way back to the beginning of time. Neither the figure nor the soap it was carved out of were self-originating, or are everlasting. In essence, the soap sculpture is empty of inherent reality as its form, if not its chemical makeup, literally dissolves before your eyes. As an aside, anyone in the audience who's studied information theory, which is the basis of modern telecommunications, would recognize the loss of information in the process of dissolving the soap as an effect of entropy, which is a fundamental physical law in the manifest of the universe that conforms very nicely with impermanence. It is fair to say that much of the actual activity in Buddhist meditation, regardless of the method used or the school of Buddhism to which one subscribes, consists of sorting through the realities in the continuum between what is manifested in the universe that we contact through our senses and penetrating this illusion to discover the ultimate truth about the self as being impermanent and empty of any fundamental independent reality. This is the continuum that I referred to previously. This exploration is one reason why meditation plays such an important role in Buddhist practice. In the ongoing present moment experience in samadhi, the sense-based link with conceptual reality gradually dissolves and reveals that the skandhas have no inherent reality or independent existence of their own. The meditator experiences and explores an open-ended sense of now, where the future comes to be understood as an imaginary extrapolation from the implied probabilities of things that may or may not yet occur, and the past consists of a wholly personal and subjective recall and interpretation from individual memory. This realization through meditation is what is described by many teachers as the baseline foundation for experiencing jhanas and more advanced states of peace and insight in meditation. This is exactly as is described so starkly in the sutra. The Heart Sutra holds that full realization of the truth throughout the emptiness of all existence is a necessary and highly beneficial key to attaining nibbana. On a psychological level, clinging to things as if they had a sense of permanence, or if we desire for them to do so, is the underlying source of suffering. Buddhism holds that the fundamental cause of our suffering in samsara is ignorance, our misunderstanding of the true nature of ourselves and the world that we experience. This is the thrust of the first and second noble truths that have to do with the universality of suffering and stress and the clinging that is its cause. The act of clinging falsely and mistakenly treats transient things and beings as if they were substantial and permanent. Clinging also encourages the delusion that our lives somehow have some sense of permanence. Of such delusions are statues and other monuments that seek to preserve identity made. Through meditation, we learn to see ourselves and all phenomena as impermanent and empty of inherent reality, as being non-self. This realization is the foundation of the third and fourth noble truths that have to do with the realization that escaping from the ongoing cycles of suffering that typify existing in samsara is possible. This is the third noble truth, and that this can be accomplished by following the eightfold path for permanently extinguishing suffering, which is the fourth noble truth. The fourth noble truth is the Buddhist promise that the steps on the path are genuinely liberating if followed to completion. The realization of impermanence has consequences for Buddhists leading their everyday lives. When we see the everyday objects we interact with as being impermanent, it no longer makes sense to cling to them as possessions, as if the illusion of possessing them is the reality, and will somehow end the stress that we experience in samsara from being governed by the first and second noble truths. This insight into the nature of attachment is why Buddhist monks surrender all their possessions on entering monastic life. For lay Buddhists, this implies living with less of an emphasis on becoming deeply enmeshed in the social, political, and economic attachments presented by everyday life. At an everyday proximate level, realization of impermanence at some level and appreciation of the path outlined in the third and fourth noble truths allows lay Buddhists to discover a limited amount of freedom and optimism in experiencing the ever-changing, interdependent, and imperfect nature of life. This relief from suffering is, and the method of attaining it, is the heart in the Heart Sutra. This brings us to the final message of the Heart Sutra that is brief, direct, and succinct. To quote, "Bodhisattvas who practice the insight that brings us to the other shore see no more obstacles in their mind, and because there are no obstacles in their mind, they can overcome all fear, destroy all wrong perceptions, and realize perfect nirvana." In this statement, we see the full thrust of the sutra. As discussed previously, this thrust shows that the key to attaining nibbana consists in gaining a full and complete insight into the fundamental nature of emptiness and its all-encompassing consequences. To quote, "All Buddhas in the past, present, and future, by practicing the insight that brings us to the other shore, are capable of attaining authentic and perfect enlightenment." Note the use of the term insight. The implication is that in addition to deep meditation, pursuit of enlightenment entails an action component that is supported by thinking and reflection rather than some sort of either-or approach. Taken in sum, the Heart Sutra is a very challenging document that succinctly and starkly states essential truths that provide guidance in pursuing the Buddhist path. Thank you.